On September the 26th, the UK's economy, the 6th largest in the world, completely collapsed, and right now the country is sitting on the verge of a very sinister crisis. But how could this happen? Just 15 years ago, and the UK was one of the world's strongest economies, but right now the country is in a severe economic crisis. The country has doubled its debt, winter blackouts are looming, the currency is crashing, and now 3/4 of British pubs face permanent closure, which is why the government is now preparing police for a breakdown in public order caused by this economic crisis. The catalyst for all of this came after an announcement from the new UK government to borrow even more billions, which sent the market spiraling out of control. This has come amidst talks of the global economy falling into a historic recession, with major banks like Deutsche Bank and Morgan Stanley rumoured to now also be on the brink of collapse, and the UK is certainly feeling the brunt of this recession. You see, the country's inflation rate has gone up over 10% this year, the highest in over 40 years. And on top of this, the UK is the only G7 country to never recover economically from COVID. And so with the government borrowing yet even more money, people finally lost all confidence that the UK could ever pay this back, causing the British pound to be valued at $1.03, its lowest ever value against the dollar. This was such a big drop that it resulted in UK citizens losing 5% of their total savings in a single day. And with the cost of living and energy crisis, the war with Russia, Brexit, constant leadership changes, rising crime rates, skyrocketing house prices, and huge debts from the virus, and a crash couldn't come at any worse a time. So then the question is, how could such disaster happen? And what's coming next for the UK? Well, to understand what's going to come next, we first need to look at what's been happening in the UK over the last decade. You see, back in 2007, if you were to look at economic reports on the UK's future, everything seemed perfect, with an LNG investment strategist James Carrick predicting the UK's GDP would steadily grow by 3% a year. And in the same year, the pound was worth $2. From 1997 to 2010, the UK's economic growth was stronger than any other G7 country. However, whilst everything was perfect in this period, this would all come to change during the 2008 financial crash. And since the crash, the UK's economy was always on a slippery slope. Because in the following years after the crash, it took the UK's economy 5 years to return to its previous size back in 2007. And to give some context of how damaging this recession truly was to the UK, the debt before the recession was 41.5% of the country's GDP. And just 5 years later, this debt would double to 83.2%. And in 2022, this figure now stands at 98.6%. As a result of this, high taxes were introduced, as well as big cuts to public services as the UK fell into austerity, which in simpler terms means that public funding for police, healthcare, etc. would be drastically cut, while taxes were increased. On the surface, these austerity measures did seem to improve the UK's economy. However, the debt levels were still out of control, and with this came rising inflation, which caused living costs to dramatically rise, all while national wages stagnated across the country. This means that there has gradually been less and less disposable income for the average Brit, and with a huge influx of migrants and oligarchs buying up homes, it wouldn't take long for home ownership to be a right only reserved for the rich, causing economic phenomena, with things like poor doors becoming more and more common in London, and people even renting out their own cupboards under the stairs for 500 quid a month. It was these sorts of things that caused the UK to be very resentful at the government, a government that seemed to be doing nothing to stop the average Brit becoming poorer.
That people have absolutely no faith in. They don't believe they will grow the economy, they don't believe they are sustainable, and the consequences of this, if you've got a mortgage, a job, you buy food, any goods and services, this country is poorer and life is harder for everyone.
However, whilst this economic situation was bad, it was nothing compared to what the UK is experiencing today, because the 2008 crash actually had similar effects on all other G7 countries. However, what made the UK special were the actions following on from this recession that would lead to the situation we're in today, because it was this growing resentment in the UK that led to Brexit and massive political changes within the UK government. Now, as we all know, in 2016, Britain decided to depart from the EU trade bloc, with the hopes of finding better trade deals abroad. The only catch here was that to get these cheaper trade deals in place would take a lot of time, meaning that if anything were to change the current economic environment, the whole UK economy would suddenly become a lot more volatile. But at the same time, it seemed like the initial loss from leaving the EU would eventually be corrected by the UK's continued strength in the global economy. However, by 2018, economists were already determining that under the free trade Brexit deal that ended up passing, the UK's growth would shrink by over 5% implement in the next 15 years. It was clear that the economic risk of Brexit was big. However, even with this in mind, if nothing got in the way of the UK's economy for the next couple of decades, it seemed like the risk could actually pay off. But little did anyone realise what was coming just around the corner.
The coronavirus is the biggest threat this country has faced for decades. All over the world, we're seeing the devastating impact of this invisible killer.
In 2020, the entire market collapsed seemingly overnight. Countries were now focusing on keeping themselves afloat as much as possible. Now no one was taking part of our heavily globalized economy, and for a nation like the UK that has built itself on being one of the most highly developed social markets in the world, a financial shift like this spelled disaster for the country. This disaster came in the form of an unprecedented drop in the formerly sky-high GDP of the UK. Over the course of the first few months of the pandemic, the country's GDP crashed by nearly 20%, which is a new record that the UK now unfortunately holds. Along with the limitations imposed internationally, the UK also implemented many domestic COVID precautions, all of which negatively compounded to the country's already stagnated economy. Measures like social distancing and travel restrictions meant all businesses were shutting down, and the UK government was having to bail out the whole country's economy. But even with this, most people still weren't shopping or visiting restaurants for fear of coronavirus, which only caused more economic devastation for the country. With the government paying for businesses to stay open, all while no one was spending any of their money, whilst also being locked up in their houses for fears of the virus, and this led to one of the most significant recessions that the nation has ever seen. However, once again, these effects were similar to other countries in G7. All of the West was facing the same issues. But what other countries weren't facing were the endless political scandals that would taint the UK's reputation internationally. You see, with Boris Johnson implementing all these restrictions, it was no surprise that the UK was taking on enormous economic damage. However, whilst these measures were in place, Johnson had attended multiple parties during the height of the coronavirus scare, all while he was preaching to his own citizens that social gatherings weren't safe.
The time has now come for us all to do more. From this evening, I must give the British people a very simple instruction. You must stay at home.
Around a year after the initial phase of the pandemic, and dozens of photos were leaked showing Johnson drinking amongst his friends and other politicians. Once the incident went public, it would be one of the main causes for Johnson's abrupt resignation and replacement. And of course there were many other factors behind this, but the public would never forgive Johnson and his antics. However, sadly for the UK, the pandemic is a blow that we still haven't recovered from. The country is still the only one in G7 that has yet to fully recover from the impact of the coronavirus, and the UK economy's weakness has led to foreign investors packing their bags and moving elsewhere, with France now set to overtake the UK on foreign investments in coming years, something that was unthinkable just 5 years ago. But trust me when I say that this is nothing compared to what's been happening in the last year, because almost straight after the country opened up again, it would be served with a new fresh crisis. But before we continue, I want to talk to you about our video sponsor Masterworks. All of this turmoil culminated with the news that terrified markets. One of the most advanced mathematical models in the world now predicts a 98% chance of recession. Of course, with this announcement, nearly every major stock went down, bringing the S&P 500's losses to around 9% for that month and over 23% for the year. And everyone was left saying, wait, I'm diversified, why is my portfolio still getting wiped out? Because according to the biggest firms in the world, they're not diversified in the right way. See, Goldman Sachs released a shocking report last week, saying the classic stock bond strategy won't be enough to keep investors afloat, as it's already down over 20% this year alone. As a result, Goldman says the ideal allocation for stocks has shrunk from 60% to around 45%. So what do they recommend you do with that difference in order to salvage your stolen returns? Invest in real assets like art. Goldman says it can protect your purchasing power even in times like these, and data shows that the last time inflation was this high, contemporary art appreciated more than real estate and even gold, at an average of 33% per year. And so how do you invest in art? Well, with Masterworks. It's a unique platform that lets you invest in contemporary art by legends like Picasso and Banksy. You see, when they sell a painting you're invested in, you see a share of the potential profits. So far, Masterworks has had 6 exits, for an average net return of 29% to investors. Some of you who have already signed up saw another exit as recently as August, for an incredible 33.1% return. As a result, Masterworks has had to acquire and release more art on their platform to meet demand, and there is a waitlist, but you can skip it by clicking the link in the description below. You see, pressure from COVID had lowered energy supplies, and this was combined with already sky-high prices. And as if this wasn't enough, Putin's invasion of Ukraine meant that all of the oil and gas that Russia used to sell to the EU vanished almost instantly. So as the supply dropped sharply, the demand rose to compensate, causing energy prices to get out of control, with most people paying on average £1,570 more a year on their energy bills. And this increase, along with the cost of living crisis, is just far too much for the vast portion of the population. especially considering that the average wage in the country is 25 grand. And as the winter draws near, it's unclear how the poorest are going to afford to heat their homes. This has been a global crisis, but it's hit the UK particularly hard. The UK relies on gas for half of its electricity, and with Putin turning off the gas pipes, it's only gotten more and more expensive. All whilst the 5 biggest oil companies saw a combined 50 billion in profits during the crisis. The UK firm BP's profits tripled to just under 7 billion, and that was only from April to June alone. On the other hand, the UK economy and its people have suffered greatly, and will especially continue to suffer this winter, which is why 75% of pub owners are now predicting that they'll be out of business with the current energy prices, which, to put in perspective, is roughly 35,000 pubs across the country and tens of thousands of jobs lost. The heart of English towns and villages decimated. But with Boris Johnson on his way out and Liz Truss in, there was a slight glimmer of hope. Maybe Prime Minister Truss could turn things around. Maybe she had a new strategy. However, it wouldn't take long after Liz Truss came to power that the whole house of cards came tumbling down. You see, during the Tory elections, Truss had promised to continue with Johnson's policies, but very quickly she would enact the most drastic change the country has seen in decades. And one of the first things that Liz did was announce a limit for the amount of money an average family could spend on energy. By setting this financial cap, it's supposed to save families around £1,000 per year, completely numbing this energy crisis. But unfortunately for the taxpayer, this plan only really works on paper. For all the savings that this will supposedly generate for the UK, it's actually ended up costing the country over £100 billion. And since the government doesn't have this kind of spending money on hand, the whole system is going bust, with Parliament having to finance this policy through their own government debt. So in other words, they are driving the country's inflation rate even higher, meaning that savings supposedly generated from the policy are now non-existent. All while things like food rise at the fastest pace within 40 years. I mean, it's got so bad now that there's even shortages of staple vegetables. And then not long after this, the UK government announced another seemingly reasonable economic strategy, the largest tax cut the country has ever seen since 1972. The so-called mini budget was anything but small. It promised to cut the basic rate for income tax, averaging out to a £170 reduction per person per year. And on top of this, the plan was to abolish the 45% additional rate of tax for people earning over £150,000. This would mean saving nearly £3,000 annually for someone who earns £200,000 a year. Overall, these tax cuts were deeply unpopular, as the rich would benefit 2 times more than the poor. And these weren't the only changes that seemed to benefit the ultra-wealthy. The cap on banker bonuses were also scrapped, as well as the planned rise in corporation tax. But where was all this money coming from? How could the UK afford to not increase tax when it was going through a cost of living crisis, an energy crisis, mountains of debt, mounting inflation, and being the only G7 country to still not recover from COVID? I mean, all of these proposed cuts would cost over £45 billion. And at the same time, the UK's public services are already at a breaking point. These cuts were designed for people to spend more of their disposable income. However, economists showed that this would be nowhere near enough to compensate for the billions of taxes the government wouldn't be collecting. Instead, the money for the government again came from borrowing. And this is what people had issues with. It wasn't just that it was another gamble at trickle-down economics, it was that the mini-budget wasn't taking into account the effect that so much debt would have on the UK, or what it would have on the already sky-high inflation. So when the new Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng announced these measures, the markets didn't react so kindly. Immediately, investors across the world were skeptical. It wasn't at all proven that this would work, and went against decades of economic planning. And one of the biggest problems investors around the world had with this was due to the investment strategy that pension funds in the UK were using. Now, this is going to get complicated, so bear with me here. Pension funds in the UK invest heavily in gilts. Now, gilts are a type of government bond that lends the government money with interest. And to protect themselves against the rates on these types of investments falling, these pension funds put up collateral to protect themselves. This means that pension funds have to pay liquid assets, usually cash, to offset their losses. Now, usually this isn't a problem. Gilts are generally safe investments and their prices aren't usually volatile, so pension funds rarely have to put up large amounts of collateral at once. But when the mini budget was announced, the price of these gilts sank sharply, and this meant that pension funds had to put up a lot of collateral very quickly.
The Bank of England has said that it will buy as many long-dated government bonds as required between now and October 14. So this is a window as it looks to stabilize financial markets.
They didn't have enough liquid cash, so they had to sell their own gilts to make it up, causing the price to drop further and further. This was the beginning of what is termed a doom cycle, as the more gilts were sold, and even more collateral needed to be put up and on until collapse. Now I know this sounds complicated, but to show how serious this was, top economists predicted these pension funds would have had to have paid as much as £550 billion in collateral if gilt prices continued to fall. And to make clear, if this happened, it would have meant that 50% of private savings would have disappeared like that. So to stop this disastrous cycle, the Bank of England had to immediately step in, and they bought up $65 billion of gilts to stabilise the price and stop this doomed cycle. And luckily for the entire United Kingdom, this actually worked. But if it hadn't, the UK economy would have crashed in the same way as many third world economies do. The IMF even told the UK government that they needed to keep inflation in check if they wanted to avoid complete economic collapse. And the markets weren't idle on their fears either. Assuming that it was about to inflate in value, everyone started selling the pound, and as more and more people sold their pounds, its value dropped further and further, and by the end of the day, the pound had hit a record low against the dollar, only being worth $1.03. And this didn't just mean that people's savings were being decimated before their eyes. With the pound dropping like stone in the water, the UK had to borrow billions more, and investors then started to worry that the UK would never be able to pay back its debts. It's now becoming very clear that the UK is in an economic disaster, and the public's reactions to these measures were just as explosive as the markets. People were so outraged that the government had to actually U-turn on their proposed tax cuts for the ultra-rich. This happening just within weeks of Liz Truss becoming Prime Minister. Mohammed Al-Arian, who once ran the world's biggest bond fund and a current advisor to Allianz, said, quote, "The bank's band-aid may stop the bleeding, but the infection and bleeding will get worse if they do not do more." And because of this deepening economic crisis, Andrew Bailey, the governor of the central bank, claimed they will, quote, "not hesitate in increasing rates by as much as needed." Now what this means is that borrowing will be harder and harder for businesses and regular people. This has caused mortgage lenders to withdraw 40% of their available mortgages from the market, which makes buying a home for millennials virtually impossible. And analysts now expect that the Bank of England is going to increase the cost of borrowing to 6% next year. Right now this number is 2.2%. So the Bank of England is going to increase the cost of borrowing by 4%, all to shore up currency and convince the markets that it's committed to getting inflation under control. The consequences of this means that next year, Brits will have to spend 3 to 4 times more to get a mortgage, making home ownership virtually impossible. And as the nation enters this economic collapse, the UK's public services are now under tremendous strain, all while the workforce has demonstrated that they're prepared to strike in large numbers over pay.
A major London tube strike is underway. It'll go on until Tuesday morning local time. The London Underground is advising people not to travel if they can.
One of the only options left to balance the books would be for the government to reduce spending. However, this would also prove to be equally politically challenging, as the country has been in austerity for almost the entire decade. But if the government doesn't do something fast, this problem is only going to get worse. According to Eurasia Analysis, quote, "Truss and Quartain are now facing a severe economic crisis as the world's financial markets wait for them to make policy changes that they and the Conservative Party will find unpalatable." But you see, whilst the UK is stuck in the mud, this whole crisis is just part of a much wider recession that's going on in both the UK and across the world. The disruptions from COVID, the Ukraine war, big banks collapsing internationally, and China's economy crumbling into the ground makes it seem like we're all in for a great reset. Perhaps now is the time that we will own nothing and be happy. By now it should be clear to all that our neoliberal political trajectory just won't cut it anymore to fortify Western civilization. It's going to take so much more than our increasingly unequal economic system to maintain what made Britain so successful. The cultural, social, political richness that made the UK a beacon of excellence is now just a distant memory, and the world is finally seeing the ugly truth. The veil is being pulled back. Which is why the World Economic Forum, billionaires, hostile governments, and multi-billion, trillion-dollar investment firms are waiting to take over. Because a ruined economy means cheaper investments, a more easily exploitable populace, and a breeding ground for economic dominance. Which is why the elite are now busy licking their lips. The UK is just an example of what's coming to everyone. Everyone who is labouring under an economic and political system that has given up on them. The complexity of the economic collapse hides the seriousness of this situation. But only when push comes to shove, when the whole house of cards comes tumbling down, will people finally realise just how screwed we truly are. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more controversial videos that I can't release to the public, consider joining the channel. For just $5.99 a month, you'll have access to monthly exclusive videos not released to the public, where you can watch our videos on Ted Kaczynski and our Mr. Robot series review, and soon we'll be releasing a video on the man behind Gay Frogs. In addition to the exclusive videos, you'll also have access to my private Discord group. All you have to do is click the join button below or click the link in the description.